All right, go ahead, Dave.
All right. Hello, everyone. So I wanted to quickly take this time to kind of go over a few websites that sort of give you a broader understanding of this concept of STIGs. So let's first start with what Wikipedia says, right? So Wikipedia tells us STIGs are an acronym that stands for Security Technical Implementation Guide. It's a configuration standard consisting of cybersecurity requirements for a product. The use of STIGs enables a methodology for securing products within networks, servers, computers, and logical designs for overall security. So where does all of this come from, and what does this fit into some of our wider understanding? So specifically, when we're talking about STIGs, we could be talking about a variety of different organizations, and typically this talks about the U.S. government. Specifically, when we are referring to STIGs, STIGs are what the DoD classifies as. And let's go ahead and look at that. So this is a glossary term from the Computer Security Research Center, which is a division of NIST. NIST stands for the National Institute of Standards and Technology. They are part of the Department of Commerce. They are part of a larger standards body within the US government that specific when we are thinking about computer security and cybersecurity help inform what are the standards by which those systems need to be held to in terms of their security. And in this case, when we are talking about STIGs, STIGs are based on Department of Defense, so US military, DoD policy, and security controls. Implementation guide that is geared towards a particular product or version contains all requirements that have been flagged as applicable from those products when they've been selected from a DoD baseline. Okay, so using just DoD as an example, the Department of Defense will select a technology and they will go through and they will determine what is an appropriate baseline for that technology, that operating system, or that software stack. A lot of what they end up choosing is based on some security frameworks and security baselines that are driven from what NIST has looked at. So where can you find out more about those? So if we go here to the DoD Cyber Public Exchange, this is run by an organization known as DISA, which stands for the Defense Information Systems Agency. Think of them as like the ISP for all of the DoD, right? They run all of the networks, they run all of the computers, a lot of the computer systems, and so on and so on. Well, what do they do? Okay, so they help generate and publish STIGs. And these are usually produced in a quarterly or sometimes yearly basis. And they come in a variety of particular frameworks. One of these is called SCAP, which is the Security Content Automation Protocol. This has been the settled on automation protocol for going through and turning on controls and setting controls as it's being handed down from NIST, right? So remember that we said that a lot of what NIST comes up with, DoD also inherits. The same is true when we start talking about things like the payment card industry or even HIPAA, right? So the healthcare standards, those also inherit from NIST. So when DISA receives a product and it's been settled on that this is the product that's going to be used in all of the DoD, right? So let's say it's let's just say it's Windows, right? Because every organization everywhere uses Windows. Okay, well they will settle on what is the benchmark, right? So what is the baseline standard that your Windows operating system needs to have a certain amount of security controls in order to be compliant to operate in any classification, right? And then there'll be subsequent classifications ranging anywhere from sensitive and public all the way up to classified in terms of how those security controls will be applied. Each security control gets a rating. It's called a CAT, right? So we get a CAT 1, a CAT 2, and a CAT 3. And these are based on the severity and risk of what would happen if these were not implemented. When you get a STIG, they come in a in like what is an XML format. We see these as an XCCDF format, and we also see this as an SCAP format. SCAP is the standard by which you can draw from to set up your scanners in order to start looking at something, right? So say we have a tenable product, we would get identifiers out of that that format in that SCAP file. We would load those into our scanner. We would select what profile and baseline we want to scan against, and it would go through and look at some of those controls. And then it would produce a results file, which is called an XCCDF file, that we could then pull into something like a STIG viewer, which is a tool also developed by DISA, in order to look at how close are we to meeting these STIGs. Okay, well, you say you're not military, and so this doesn't really apply to you. Okay, but your industry may have some form of security technical implementation guide that may not actually be a STIG, but it may be something that you need to think about, right? So for instance, the DoD has a lot of these instructions and informations that come in different standards, and you need to adhere to them based on what you're doing, right? So say you're a defense contractor. Well, you need to apply certain security controls in order to actually develop a product. Say you're working for the payment card industry. Well, you need to have certain controls in place, even on your website, in order for you to meet whatever that standard is. And so if we look at it, right, so NIST keeps a lot of these checklists. And so some of these checklists, again, come in the SCAP format. And some of these come in the XCCDF format. And these will come from different authorities that author those standards, right? So for DoD, that's the Defense Information Systems Agency. For some other entities, perhaps even the Department of Justice, they may be inheriting them from the Center of Internet Security, and so on and so on and so on. And right, we can see that there's a whole large number of authorities that will necessarily create different standards that you will need to adhere to, right? So maybe that's the NSA. Maybe that's actually a vendor themselves, right? So a vendor, Microsoft, may have a security baseline that you should adhere to when you're deploying a Microsoft product. Red Hat may have one. And this becomes very important when we start thinking about how are we going to do defense in depth. Well, we have to start from a good secure baseline. Well, what is a good secure baseline? Well, there are standards bodies that are comprised of industry professionals, computer scientists, government officials, and so on, that here in the United States, and even in larger parts of North America, Canada and Mexico, that have come together and have settled on, this is what we want in our network. This is how you need to have your system configured. And so when you start thinking about how am I going to design defense for maybe even say like a cyber game, we also need to think about that a cyber game, you know, has nothing more than a set of STIGs that you have to meet. And those STIGs are actually what is the vendor baseline, right? So there's a larger world when it comes to these things, and this gets into whole things like legal authority and compliance. And when you're not compliant, you can get something as bad as, you know, a slap on the wrist saying, hey, don't do this again, or even something as bad as getting a POAM, or even having your program shut down, or your software shut down, or your company shut down until you meet those security requirements. So I wanted to take that time to just sort of briefly talk about that, and I hope you've taken something away from it. And so with that, I'd like some audience participation. If anybody has any feedback, or hey, Dave, that's good, but there's actually this piece that you're missing when you're talking about this particular thing when it relates to STIGs.
Yeah, so I had a question about STIGs. So from what you're seeing in industry, you know, you're saying it's required for the DoD space, and so I guess is it currently 100% adopted? Like, how well are the different places adopting and applying STIGs?
So I can't speak for other industries, right? Like so, like I can't speak for what the energy sector does. Although I've seen, obviously, from googling online that there are standards that say an industrial control system needs to meet in order to operate in X market, right? But when it comes to Department of Defense side of things, absolutely, you need to have your STIGs in place, and it usually does come down to who's your auditor and who's looking at it, right? So if we're and really this comes to also something called DFARS, right? Which is there's a larger set of standards that a contractor may need to meet in order to get authority to operate on even developing an information system. And when we say information system, um, we don't just mean like, hey, you're standing up a very special computer, right? Maybe to go be part of like some imagery analysis, or maybe part of like, the early warning system for the Coast Guard in detecting, when there's like, bad weather or something like that. We mean the whole piece, right? So where does that software sit? What are the interconnected information systems that connect to it? What are the networks that connect to it? How does this interface with the larger world? What are the other interconnections that come into that? And part of adhering to these STIGs is you're adhering to the spirit and the intent of the STIG is normally how it's interpreted, right? So some of the language and the wording can be a little bit vague, and you need to have the ability to interpret that. And usually that comes from, there are people that have come before you that have already maybe done the work in your organization, and so they're a great resource to tap into. But it also comes from a lot of times there'll also be like web URLs that you can go follow that may point to vendor documentation, right? And so they may be pulling from a variety of different sources in order to establish this standard. And it may depend on your operating authority, right? So your operating authority may say, I don't want any Cat ones in my net, on your information system coming into my network. Okay. Well, then you got to remediate all of those, and then you got to go through a scan, right? And they scan it, and maybe that's done automated and then probably validated by hand. And then when you're done with that, they may say, okay, great, you're good to go. Or they may say no Cat ones and no Cat twos. Maybe they even might say no Cat ones, no Cat twos, no Cat threes. But this all depends on where is it going, and who, as your counterpart, say if we're a contractor, who your counterpart is that has said, hey, I don't want this. We can't have this in our environment. And maybe they're not the ones that set that standard. Maybe their CSO set that standard. Maybe some other standards body that they have to answer to has said, hey, your systems need to be, this secure. And so they go look at these standards and they do an assessment and say, oh, okay, so I just need no Cat ones and no Cat twos, and I'll fit most of this criteria. I hope that kind of answers your question. I don't feel like I might have, but please let me know.
This is a really big topic, and it can go in so many different directions. So I thought the information you shared was very useful. So before I get into one of the links that Jesse shared with the team, I'm curious in terms of, so I feel that the government sector, the DoD, that you're sort of have a lot of familiarity, Dave, they operate and have a certain different culture. And then I feel that, Dave, now you're getting a lot into the cloud stuff, right? DevOps type environment. And I haven't really seen STIGs in the DevOps environment because they're all about moving fast and trying a lot of different cutting edge technology. So, just off the cuff here, Dave, how do you feel that STIG culture and applying STIGs, and does that make sense for a lot of the stuff that's happening in the cloud right now, where I'm not really seeing STIGs in the cloud? So what do you think about that?
So a lot of this has actually changed with the last previous CTO of the Air Force. And the Air Force has kind of led the way when it comes to this. They have developed something called Platform One, where this is their take on a DevOps platform that is based on a Kubernetes distribution that uses cloud native, components that have met those STIG requirements to already begin operating. And so this takes a lot of the previous work that had to go into making sure that, oh, the operating system and our software deploys to can fit that. Whereas this is now a DoD platform that contains all of these different pieces all put together, right? And so in that sense, then if your software can say survive on platform one, then your software now has become, it can get what is known as a continuous ATO, right? So these systems will have containers that are stored in a central repository that have already been stigged, that have already gone through that hardening process. And say you had a container that you built that you wanted to bring into the environment, well, then it would have to go through their checks in order to see, have you met all of this? And then it would, if it didn't meet, those checks would be kicked back to you. So part of this larger way is that software factories, Andy, are actually being stood up. So entire CI/CD pipelines that have been built by the Air Force that can be leveraged by other branches that allow you to build your systems and build your environments to meet whatever the say the impact level as they're talking about here, and the classification of where that system's going to end up to. Maybe this is an unclassed system. Maybe this is a top secret system. Maybe this is an SCI system, right? So, and I think this is actually part of a larger shift within the government space, at least in the military side of things, that let's take it out of the hands of individual contractors, individual commercial side of things, and instead let's have you adhere to our larger platform. Let's use some of this off-the-shelf commercial off-the-shelf software. Let's use some of this open source, this FOSS software, and let's build a platform that you can hook your technology stack into. Let's prioritize the developer, let's prioritize security, and let's actually begin to basically eat our own dog food, right? Like, let's build a platform where you can go do that. So I hope that kind of answers part of your larger question of how is this happening in terms of cloud? Well, so instead of just these nebulous documents that you need to adhere to, because that still is the case, there is still a lot of software that's going to be developed and deployed. Maybe it's just like a desktop application that none of this is really going to apply to, right? But if we're talking about, say, like a web-based application or other things like that, or any type of application that uses a cloud backend, then using a lot of what they're talking about here for platform one is definitely going to be part of that, right? So there are different components here that are fitting into larger pieces of who's choosing what, right? So like they've developed something that's called Cloud One. It's a mirroring of AWS GovCloud and Azure Government that kind of allows you access to both of these through some kind of front end that a contractor has developed. So I hope that kind of answers your wider question, in that there's, like, if you want to know more about that, definitely go to softwareaf.mil or just Google Platform One, and you'll kind of get a larger idea of what this kind of looks like. And many of the things that are happening in the DoD space is we're shifting away from older standards to something that's like called the cybersecurity maturity model, that more leverages how mature is a company's security platform and security practices when it comes to how do you engage with, keeping your information secure. And a lot of this is also coming because there's a larger shift now to let's have newer software practices, but let's actually codify these into actual structures that contractors and others can actually go touch into, right? Like there's things like Rancher Federal, and there's GitLab government, there's these different software stacks that are for government. But now it's, how does all of that fit together in a wider piece? So I hope that answered your question. That's about all I can say about that.
Yeah, so quick comments before I let Jesse jump in, and hopefully he'll start a conversation about one of the articles that he shared. But I really like the part where they're, like you're saying, they're allowing for the principle of what these efforts are trying to do, and they're starting something, so that's good. And I also really like your clarification in terms of there are some STIGs that will be applicable to a server, but makes no sense for a desktop, right? And I think those details are really important because unfortunately, sometimes what happens with these policies and these standards is that when you're trying to apply them to a place where they don't make sense, you can actually lower the security because the users will find ways of working around and basically making your system more insecure because they have to get their work done, and it doesn't make sense to apply some of these requirements to system where it doesn't make sense. So with that, I will like pass the baton to Jesse to see if he wants to lead the discussion about that article right there, because I thought that's super interesting. And first off, it kind of the first thing I want to say about it was like you kind of need this is making the news because this is a problem, right? In terms of you are having contracts who are not reporting on these security incidents that do happen, and that's really really bad. So with that, go ahead.
I'm sorry I was late, David. I love you are talking about STIGs. Oh my gosh, that's near and dear to my heart. Like I've done workshops at the university on STIG slash CIS benchmarks. I've actually been an implementer of them. And so there's a few things I'd like to talk about before I go into this. This article really just shines the light on the government saying that, hey, if you do business with us and you have like a grant, we expect you to, well, one, report the breach, and two, don't misrepresent your security practices. So one of those misrepresentations could be like, oh yeah, we secure, but it's like, do you secure? Do you use STIGs, right? Do you do this? Prove that. Don't misrepresent that security practice. Or we're going to sue you. But to go to that cloud comment earlier, that's another thing. So CIS security, so the Center for Internet Security has, I don't know if we want to bring it up, but they basically have hardened images for Azure, GCP, AWS, you name it. And they've already got, all right, here are the settings already rocking and rolling for you to just start off as a hardened system. And so, yeah, you could probably, even have for Docker, cool. But yeah, so like I think I put it in the chat though there. You can click on the chat and you'll see where it says cloud, hardened images. And so they do that. However, in my role, I typically say, hey, just do whatever's in the Active Directory and basically use like the STIGs, right? And go ahead and just do it that way if you're connected to an Active Directory. And typically people they're not doing these one-off things, but if you do one-off things in the cloud, definitely go ahead and use these benchmarks that are already done up for you, which this was done years and years ago. I like now, like Microsoft is kind of getting on the bandwagon, like AKA, like if you go and try to set up a Kubernetes infrastructure, they're like, here's a Kubernetes, just like plain vanilla. Now here's a hardened one. It's like, well, why didn't we do that a long time ago? We were always just like, just do the plain vanilla, don't even do the hardened one. And so now at least they're like, here's a hardened one. So I'm like, yes, so good. Yeah. Go ahead, David.
No, and I was just gonna say, like, yeah, thank you for bringing up CIS, and I think I mentioned it, but I didn't dive too deep on it. So there's DISA for like the DoD, and the NSA for the DoD and intelligence community side of things. Could you maybe speak a little bit about what CIS is?
Yeah.
I think it's a very important comment because you're right. Using what CIS has provided there, and using these images, it's no different than when as a developer, don't go roll your own cryptography library. Go use something that's already a standard, good, proven cryptography library. And this applies the same for administrators when we're building networks and building systems. So if you could just speak a little bit about CIS and what they do, I think that'd be very helpful for our audience.
Yeah, absolutely, for sure. So yeah, back in the day, way back in the day, they basically had benchmarks out there that were just PDFs that administrators had to go through like line by line and like go to systems and configure them, and it was just lame. And nowadays they actually have automated that thing to just kind of just do it for you via like GPOs. right? And so that's super great. So the thing I like to shine, because I'm from like a university setting right now, is the STIGs are great because they're free 99, free 99 to get the STIGs. If you are not part of some kind of membership, state, local government, you do not get Center for Internet Security for free. You pay like, I think it's 25,000 a year to get all the membership benefits, unless you're like a state, local government kind of thing, and the university falls under that. So we are allowed to use these things. And so that's kind of like the difference between the STIGs and this. They're pretty close. I've done some comparisons, and I've seen a lot where I'm like, I would recommend doing the STIGs because they're a little more advanced in what they are enabling security. For one of the things that I was like pushing on CIS to change that STIGs had was PowerShell script block logging to capture, like, say, like some evil encoded base64 thing from PowerShell, from like PowerShell Empire or something like that. Once it hits the system, it goes into the log, but it's this big blob of power, base64. Now, with PowerShell script block logging goes, the next thing that goes in the event view is like, I think event 401 or something, and it decrypts it. And so you see everything. You're like, oh, it's going to this server at this IP address, and it's trying to do what? Crap, that's evil. And so it's super fantastic. But the CIS part of that, doing it for like Windows 10, they were like, no, we don't suggest doing that. Don't enable that. And I'm like, what? You're crazy. But if you go to STIGs, they enable it. And like, yeah, I'm like, yeah, they know what's happening. So that brings me to the red teamer in me. So the red teamer in me goes, okay, yeah, these STIGs are good. Yeah, the CIS is okay. However, I want the top 10 things that the pen tester would do. I want you to like stop Mimikatz, SE debug. I want you to like turn off SMB version 1, which the STIGs and CIS does. I want you to turn, W digest. I want you to make sure that's a GPO that's always constantly being scanned. And I want you to monitor these things. I want you to go past the STIGs. I want you to go past the CIS. I want you to monitor these. So when a red teamer or a nation state or anybody comes into your system and they're like, oh, these people they're super secure with STIGs, they're super secure with CIS. But I'll just go in here, since I have elevated my authority, I'm just going to turn on SMB version 1, make that weakness happen. I'm going to turn on W digest. I'm going to reboot your system, make you re-sign in so your credentials go cache plain text up into LSAS, and I'm going to dump those out. Like, I'm going to do all these nefarious things, and you're not going to see anything without detection. So my biggest proponent, yes, this is great and this is awesome. However, once someone gets in with like a fish or something, right, and they're a known person, a known account, they can just turn things on all over the place, and just you're blind to it, and you're just pwned. So that's my biggest shine to that. So back to this article. So yeah, your security practices. So in your security practices, you should have detection in there, and don't say that my default logging is detection. It's like, no, Windows default logging is not detection. I can show you an example of that if someone wanted to know. That's my rant on that.
Yeah. Quick comments. I sort of want to piggyback there, and I think you totally tied in what Dave was saying about he wanted the Cyberforce competition to be able to use the concepts encapsulated within the STIG and basically emphasize those so the students can actually understand those underlying concepts. So that was really amazing that you sort of gave all those examples. And then according to what you're saying, you're sort of hoping that eventually defenders will be able to evolve to a higher level where they have the awareness and that visibility, so they'll understand, hey, this is what STIGs will give you, but for the more advanced adversaries, you need these additional capabilities, so you'll understand, okay, if that hacker, the nation state, he's able to compromise his account, a lot of these assumptions for your STIGs, they've been bypassed because of his level of access, right? And yeah, excuse me. So yeah, I guess according to your rant and the comments you're saying, I'm hoping for the Cyberforce competition, at first we'll get the students to that baseline of the STIGs, and then hopefully, as the next year, we'll be able to one up that and get to this place where they're like, okay, they understand what the STIGs give them, and then they'll understand what they need above and beyond the STIGs to be able to handle the APTs. So awesome.
Right, and I just wanted to finish off there with kind of tying back to this wonderful article, Jesse, that you put out there. Is that, yes, we need to follow. What I'm kind of taking away from this article is that, they're going to start suing contractors who misrepresent themselves. But I think that also comes to the wider thing of like why you should even pay attention to STIGs and standards. In that, if you're not starting from, it would be great for us to have advanced logging capabilities, right? Behavior-based antivirus systems, robust incident response plans, leveraging tools, doing continuous pen testing, purple teaming, right? Constantly trying to attack our own systems and automating that. But if we don't start from a good, secure starting block, we can't advance to those wider things, right? And so when we start even talking about things like cloud, right? Like that same practice also stands. If you don't start with like basic things, right? Like don't make your blob storage publicly accessible beyond your subscription or your VPC, right? Don't make it publicly routable. That's a basic thing. But if people aren't following those basic things and removing the low hanging fruit, then it makes it so that you can't get better at defending your own systems, and as a result, it makes it easier for the attacker. So I just wanted to finish on that point. Thank you everybody for participating. Candy, I will stop sharing and pass it back over to you.
Yeah, so that's sort of a really good conclusion. And one thing I can say is that point you're saying about students understanding routable IP address and how that's so important as a basic security. The students this year will probably have to deal with something like that during the competition. So with